War is tough. It's even tougher if you have to defend yourself. But what happens if both sides end up defending themselves? We're learning about what that means, not only in terms of a broader military standpoint, but also in terms of how it impacted Western New York. It's all here on this week's episode of the Greater West State of Greater Western New York Report, which, as always, is brought to you by...
Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard.
The Linden Honey Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa.
Hi there, and welcome everyone to this week's edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. I'm Chris Carosa. With us today is author Rob Thompson. He wrote a book called Behold and Blush. In fact, he wrote many books, and we'll talk about those in a second. But first, Rob, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and how you grew up, all that sort of thing.
How I grew up is a complicated story. It'll take about 17 shows, but thanks for having me today. I was born and raised in South Lima down in Livingston County. And when they say a small town, it's a small town, 200 people on a good day. And I graduated Livonia High School along with my wife, Kendra, in 1982, class of 82. And after high school, we kind of drifted our separate ways. I went out west. I eventually completed my bachelor's in human service and my master's in English lit. I turned to writing about 20 years ago because I had nothing else to do, and I loved history. My dad was a history buff. He introduced me to the local works of Arch Merrill at the time, and I really got into that stuff, particularly local history. And it led to really what culminated with this work here, Behold and Blush, was I do credit my dad, but also Arch Merrill.
You've written a number of books. Tell us a little
Yes.
bit about those other books first, and maybe about what it's like to be an author.
Well, don't get into writing if you want to make money, because it doesn't really work. But I remember this, and I tell this story a lot. When I was a young kid, my mom loved the TV show The Waltons, and there was only 3 channels at the time, so we had to watch it with mom. And they had an older son, John Boy, who was an aspiring writer. And he, if you remember any scenes from that show, he would look out his bedroom window and he'd write the thoughts for the day. Well, that window to me represented the future, or what it represented, a doorway to the imagination. And that's how I began writing very early. My first work was a short story called The Yellow Rose. And that's developed over the years into plays, some 23 published books, at least another 3 unpublished, short stories, just can go on and on and on. I didn't think I'd ever do it for money. We've been kind of lucky pre-COVID to be in a position where we had enough works out there that were popular that we did make a little bit of money, but COVID and its immediate aftermath has brought that to an end. So,
Well,
go ahead.
Before we get into your current book, just really quick, I'm curious.
Sure.
What is your most popular book you got out?
That was a good one. When my wife and I got back together, we paid a visit to Mount Hope Cemetery. We were looking for one particular grave, and that was Francis Tumblety. If you might remember, Francis Tumblety was a prime suspect as Jack the Ripper, and he's buried up there in Rochester. So we wrote a novel called From Hell: The Final Days of Jack the Ripper. Now, the only time of the year it sells is at Halloween, which is fine with me because it still does really well. But that was very, very graphic, and I had it was my first attempt at a historical fiction where I don't deviate from the the elements of the true crimes, but I invented a story around Francis Templeton being the killer and making his way back to New York and to actually our home territory here in Genesee County.
Wow. Actually I
Yeah.
remember that story. I remember. I don't know. Maybe I've seen your book without even knowing.
Yeah.
It's been a while. But so tell us about this new book, Beholden Blush. First of all, the
But
title. Where does the title come from?
when, well, I have to do a little backstory to it. My dad was a history buff, and we were 7 and 8 years old, and he always take us every summer up to the ambuscade just above the southern end of Canisius Lake, where Boyd and Parker were massacred. And when I started researching this book several years ago, I saw a quote from one of the soldiers who found the bodies, who discovered the bodies, and I included it in the book. And part of his quote was, "Those who see the scene, those who conducted the scene, those who perpetrated the scene will someday behold and blush at what they wrought." So that I kind of borrowed the title from a soldier who found the bodies.
Interesting. Now, so the how long did it take you to research this?
Almost 3 years. When I do a nonfiction piece, I want to make sure that I have at least two verifiable sources. And maybe you can attest to that. Writing something on the Revolutionary War era, you get a lot of rumors, a lot of speculations, but very little hardcore actual facts. And that's frustrating at times. I could get into all the rumors, and it's not nonfiction if it's rumor. It's more of a novel. And so I had to get away from all that, and I really researched State Archives of Pennsylvania, the journals of the expeditions, not so much the officers, but there were some NCOs, sergeants, and so forth that wrote some very interesting journals and personal opinions of what they saw during the war. So once I could take that and then delve into the newspaper archives, from 1820, where they were celebrating the 50th anniversary, then the 100th, the centennial, and even some of the works of and the writings and the memoirs of Mary Jemison, I was able to, get some of these facts down to being manageable. And that's what we did with Behold and Blush. There's probably 40 pages of resources. And, that's what makes it fun. You dive into the research and find stuff that you didn't think, or personally, I don't think a lot of people have ever seen before. And that's what makes it really fun, is you can get into some of these things that, hey, this is first time this stuff has been seen in 120 years, And that's what we did.
You mentioned actually two characters in this saga, and we'll talk about the broader campaign after the first break. But I think it's interesting to go into a couple of these personal stories. Let's start with Thomas Boyd. And Thomas Boyd was involved in a horrific massacre, and it occurred right here in Western New York, in Livingston County.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about the Thomas Boyd story, both the fact and the hearsay.
The fiction.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the hearsay does make for great novel work down the road, but Thomas Boyd was from Pennsylvania, and some of your listeners, and probably you can correct me on some of this, is we talked earlier that sometimes my gray matters doesn't remember a lot of things. He had a real successful, really, he took part in an invasion of Quebec, I think with Benedict Arnold at the time. Then he was captured. Then he went back to Pennsylvania. He had several brothers, extended family, and I believe his sister Mary. As soon as he returned to Pennsylvania, he went and joined the Pennsylvania Riflemen. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe they were part of the Morgan Riflemen. And from that, he joined up with George Washington. And to make a longer story short, when Washington saw the importance of the riflemen, he saw them as an integral part of the Indian expedition that was had to take place to free the frontier, the western frontier at that time, both from the Loyalists and the Native Americans. Now, the Loyalists, I've learned throughout this, the Butlers in particular, were more vile and more hateful than any of the Seneca could ever be. But Thomas Boyd, when they reached the area of the foot of Canisius Lake, September 12th, September 11th, 1779, was charged with by John Sullivan to form a scouting party and go find the largest Seneca village, which was Little Beardstown, in the area of Geneseo and Collierville. And it's once they reached they believe they found it. Then upon their return to Sullivan's camp just above Canisius Lake is where they were ambushed. About 25 men at the time. So fiction is that, I had to disprove that Thomas Boyd didn't disobey a direct order from John Sullivan. The records show them, the aide-de-camp to Sullivan at the time, said, and he heard it, that Sullivan directed Boyd only take 4 or 5 men with you and a good Indian scout. Instead, Boyd took anywhere up to 25 men. From what I've been able to see, I believe that Sullivan approached Thomas Boyd outside the tent, outside the ears of witnesses, and said, use your discretion. Do what you think you need to do to accomplish this mission. I think at that point, he recruited Timothy Murphy. He recruited mostly fellow riflemen to go with him on that what turned to be infamous journey.
What happened?
They left the night, I want to say September 12th. And again, if I'm off a day, I apologize. They reached what they believe was the outskirts of Little Beardstown. But there was a confusion as to what village did they meet. One path went north, one path went south. Scouts said, take this path. You run into less trouble. Another path, scouts said, go north. My understanding from what I read, Boyd decided to follow the same path he took to return to the lake. What nobody knew, and I didn't know until I researched this, that the whole time, from the time they left Canisius Lake on the beginning of the journey, they were being watched by Joseph Brant and the Loyalists. They were just watching them the whole night. And upon their return, I would say that the Indians baited them a little bit, because Murphy, my understanding, fired at one of the Indian scouts and killed him. Took the scalp that he was noted to do. And at that point, Brant believed they were being surrounded by the bulk of Sullivan's army still encamped at the lake, and just encircled the group. Most of them were killed there at the spot. I have at least 8 survivors that did escape, one being Timothy Murphy. And Boyd and Parker, from what I've read, one Achilles was cut by, I think, the son butler, and that would be Warren, I think was his name. He cut one of their Achilles, and they were forced to walk to what is now Collierville, to the area of Collierville. And there they were essentially tied to a big oak, and known throughout Western New York as a torture tree. Still stands. And there they were just obliterated. And there you go, right there. You'll see the monument there. That's the road between Geneseo and I believe that's Leicester, Collierville area. And picture this. I tried to figure out in doing this book how tall the tree would have been 200 something years ago. I put that mission aside right away because it's too difficult. But both men were tied to this tree. Sergeant Michael Parker was beheaded, they said, right away. But Thomas Boyd, they did everything you could think of doing to him. Eventually beheading him. They took out part of his intestine, fastened it to the tree, made him run around the tree till he couldn't do it anymore. Some say he gave up information on the whereabouts of Sullivan's troop and how many men and artillery and so on and so forth. Others say he didn't give it up. There's no witness to what he did and didn't do. The only witness that I think could have said anything may have been Little Beard himself, who was known to conduct. He was the master of ceremonies, so to speak, of these events, or Mary Jemison. I haven't been able to prove that she was there or not there. But her husband, her second husband, I'm going to butcher that name, is Hayakatu, I believe, was the most vicious of warriors. He was not kind in any way, and he was noted to kill not only women and children, but infants down at Cherry Valley.
So there is, and we got a break in a second, but
Sure.
I just want to get to one part of this story. Wonder if you were able to confirm it or not. Supposedly, the Thomas Boyd and Joseph Brant Butler were all Masons,
Mm,
and Thomas Boyd signaled to Joseph Brant that he was a
yep.
Mason, and Brant said, "Okay, we're going to spare you." Brant leaves. Butler,
Right.
also a Mason, says, "Well, forget that."
Right.
Is this a true story? Also,
Yeah, yeah. Both were said to be Masons. We tell the story how Joseph Brant went over to England and was actually welcomed into the Masons by, I think, King George himself over there. And he comes back, and most officers, I believe, at the time were probably Masons. And throughout, we post several examples in the book of how Brant really did save Continental troops or soldiers by when they offered the sign of a brother in distress. But when Brant was called away there at the torture tree, yeah, then, you know, Butler said, okay, I'm not going to give you the same, I'm not going to be as altruistic, so to speak. And that was the death bell when Brant got called away. Brant wasn't, from everything I read, he didn't deserve the title beast or monster or whatever we call him. He was a decent, kind, good man who was just trying to do the best for his people.
so we'll get a little bit more into that and talk about Mary Jemison when we come back
Sure.
on this episode of the state.
Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. 50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com.
Welcome back, everyone, to this week's edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. I'm Chris Carosa, and with us this week is Rob Thompson. He is the author of Behold and Blush, and really a thoroughly researched book on the Sullivan Expedition. God, I don't think it was an expedition. So very briefly, another source that you used was Mary Jemison. Who was Mary Jemison, and why was she such an important source?
She was, her family had relocated from Ireland to Pennsylvania. Then a number of the Irish settlers then moved to the area of what is now Gettysburg, that area there. And I'm going to be off probably a year or two, but she was captured in her, around 1753 when she was 12 or 13 years old. And she was spared, her life was spared by two Indian women who welcomed them into, they welcomed her into their family in exchange because they had a brother that was killed, and tradition was that you can either do what you want with a captive. So they welcomed her in as a sister, and she was raised and spent her entire life, well, right up until about 1879, with the Seneca. And she relocated when Sullivan came through Western New York. She relocated with her children to what is now the area of Letchworth State Park, and that's where she lived. Boy, I want to say until 1820, somewhere in there. Then she went up to Buffalo Creek Reservation, and that's where she passed away in 1823. But one of her life's culminations, one of the projects she completed was her biography. And she told the story to then a resident of Darien, New York, not too far from where I live, who wrote the book, sat with her for 3 or 4 days, and compiled her biography. And in that, granted, it flows and it's not structured, and modern linguists will say, man, it's poorly written. But in her tales, you can tell what she went through and her views on a lot of things, including, I think she remained a Christian her entire life because her mother taught her, said, she reminded her the day that she was captured, always say your prayers just for the sake of remembering your English language and your heritage. But she was a remarkable woman, and there's a photograph I included in the book about her reburial at Lettsworth State Park. Right there, that was about 1874. And because the Buffalo Creek, up where the casino is now, had fallen into great disrepair, and William Letchworth said, met with Mary's family, her children, and extended grandchildren, and worked out an arrangement where they brought her to the area, excuse me, where she had lived for so long at Letchworth State Park. That's where she is now. That's where she rests.
Let's get into the actual Sullivan campaign itself. And first, there's the setup. Then we'll put up the map of what it actually
Okay.
looked like. We could talk about that. But it really came about as a reaction to several what we might call today terrorist massacres. I don't think
Oh,
there's
sure.
another way to explain it. If you look at the record, I just read 1900. It was an anniversary book on the Wyoming County Massacre. This
Yeah.
is in northeastern Pennsylvania. And some of the graphic details of what was done,
Yep.
not suitable for
It's not. No.
And the same thing occurred in Cherry Valley, which is near the Hudson Valley, right around there,
Yep.
of New York, which were the outer extremes of the New York County at that time.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, Rob, Washington gave Sullivan a set of instructions on what to do in this campaign. Just kind of tell us what those instructions were and why they might have caused some
Well, the order dates, I believe, to May 31st of 1779, and it's about 2 pages long, but in no uncertain terms, it's a scorched earth policy. It was to destroy the crops of the Seneca, destroy their homes, their villages, kill the livestock, and also make it sure that they could not replant again. That in future years they'd be unable to use the ground and to replant. The expedition would force, it was estimated, some 5,000 Seneca up to Fort Niagara with the British. What I had to think, and I think what's important to know, is that not only I think Washington was targeting the British more than he was the Seneca, because the British had to live off the same crops. They had to live off the same livestock, the Indians, and so on and so forth. So not only was he starving the Seneca, he was starving the British. So if he could force 5,000 hungry Seneca into a decimated Fort Niagara with hungry British soldiers and so on and so forth, he may very well anticipated bringing the war to an end in 1779.
Let's
But
go over the exact map of what Sullivan
okay,
did. And it wasn't just Sullivan. So tell us who all the players were that were involved with this on the American side and how they ventured into what ended up being this.
Washington devised what was a four-prong approach. One was, you see on the left side of the screen, is Downey Broadhead was coming up from Fort Pitt. And his job was to come up to what is now currently Cattaraugus County, not too far from Canisius Lake, or what you see is the ultimate goal of Sullivan being Little Beardstown, or Genesee Castle at the time. So Broadhead was to come up in April of 1779 to the left side of your screen. Over on the right side, pardon me, that was August of 1779. The four-prong attack began over on the right side of the screen. You see just above Cherry Valley with the Gozen von Scheck expedition against the Onondaga. I believe it was General Schuyler recommended to Washington that he could not venture into Seneca territory with an angry Onondaga nation on his right flank. So if you can envision Sullivan coming up the center of the flank, center of the screen, the Onondaga would have been on the right-hand side. So the goal was from Von Scheck was to scatter the Onondaga, which they effectively did over a 30-day period. With Broadhead coming up from the south, they were pinching the Seneca and the Onondaga, both aiming towards sending them ultimately to Fort Niagara. Sullivan would have come down from, I believe it was Fort Hunter at the time, to meet Sullivan's force, who had left Easton down near Philadelphia, to where the spot is on the map you see is Fort Sullivan, right at the New York line. There they established a little, at Tioga Point, a little fort called Fort Sullivan. We include that in the book. We also include the number of women that actually accompanied the expedition up to Fort Sullivan. From there, they had the two skirmishes that were part of the Sullivan Expedition, Chemung and the Battle of Newton. After the Battle of Newton, it was decisive enough where Sullivan sent his large artillery back to Fort Sullivan. And so they proceeded throughout the campaign up past Seneca Lake to the north of Canandaigua and Hemlock with just smaller pieces of artillery. And a bit of backstory, that's something my dad always told us kids, is Sullivan lost one of his cannon at the foot of Canisius Lake and is buried in the mud. Well, sorry, Dad, but I never found that. There was no lost cannon, but that was one of the stories I had fun pursuing, was seeing if I could find my dad's story of the lost cannon. So when I get to Geneseo and Genesee Castle, or Little Beardstown, they just, along the way, they obliterated every Indian village they found. Longhouse after longhouse. Wiped out all the crops. It was really a scorched earth policy that destroyed thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of crops, and I believe in excess of 50 Indian villages. And all of Seneca then, most of them went towards Fort Niagara, and there it was just famine, and it was at the time of the year where the elements claimed a number, but at that point, Mary Jemison decided to separate from the Seneca, and she thought she could better take care of herself and her children by separating from the Seneca people, and she went to Letchworth State Park.
So the interesting thing about this scorched earth policy is, first of all, it wasn't new. It wasn't new, and this wasn't the last case, because the most famous example is Sherman's March to the Sea during the Civil War, which is effectively the same strategy. It wasn't necessarily to kill the opposition, but it is to reduce their ability to make war.
Right.
And even if you look at the Iroquois Confederacy and the history of their war-making tactics, very similar. They would eradicate villages. If you saw what happened with the Erie, all the villages of the Erie were burnt except for one, which was then adopted and absorbed into the Iroquois, into the Seneca Nation. Different kind of story on that one. But the idea of this type of military strategy is not new, and it brings up the question that you address in your book, and I thought you did a really good job on how you did it. A lot of people say, "Oh, Sullivan is genocide," without even looking at what the Iroquois Confederacy has done.
Right.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about how you talked about that.
Well, I got a lot of comments about when I started this book. Comments on Facebook will say, "Well, it's genocide, pure and simple. It's murder, and I don't want to talk about it." Okay, well, you can't have a conversation if you're not willing to talk about facts, but rely strictly on emotion. You're right that this strategy was not introduced to the Western Hemisphere by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. It goes back to this, as far when man was first started slinging bows and arrows, it goes back to that point. It was a tactic used, perhaps we could see it in Cherry Valley and in Wyoming, down in Pennsylvania, obliterated everything. Well, there's one reason that they did that, was to prevent settlement and to prevent the ability to support continental troops and militia and so on and so forth. So rather than, I knew this chapter had to be talked about because it's a contemporary issue that, I envision myself talking to this 22-year-old college sophomore who's arguing how terrible the United States is and how terrible our history has been. And I want to present them with facts. And I based my opinion on whether it was a genocidal act off the 1948 United Nations Convention on Genocide. How do they define it? How was that defined at the time? And I bring in examples of the Holocaust, and we can think about Darfur and Rwanda and any race, any gender, not gender, but any ethnicity has both been the perpetrator and the victims of hate. I provide my answer to, do I think it was genocide, by using definition of the Genocide Convention. And I'll let the readers figure out for themselves. I could tell you my opinion, but nobody really wants to know my opinion. I'll let the readers figure out for themselves. I present the facts and let them take it from there.
Well, I mean, if you, as you kind of, and I'm trying to get the name so that I can see it. As you so aptly pointed out, the idea that this wasn't new, that this was historically accurate, and a strategy that really is a military strategy that was considered within the realm of war. I mean, all sparing.
And also religion. If you
Yeah,
look at, it's not so much a tactic of war, it's a tactic of people. I hate my neighbors. I hate what they think. I hate what they do. This and that. And, in today's world, I think we see it where we have redefined the English language so much we're afraid to say anything. So that means we broaden the English language, but we can't use it.
well,
So it's
your use of the United Nations definition of genocide, as you mentioned in the book, really is the introduction of that term, genocide.
right,
So there
right.
was no feeling of ethnic cleansing. I think that's the word that we use now. Back in that day, and heck, if you look at the Sullivan campaign, it was not an ethnic oriented campaign.
Mm.
Sounds like I got an echo there. Since it targeted, what it really targeted was the enemy, the loyalists and the Iroquois allies that they had. And in
Right.
fact, the, one of the nations, the Oneida, accompanied Sullivan. And
Oh, sure. And then the Tuscarora as well.
yeah, go ahead and let's talk briefly about how the Patriot side, the American side, actually did have Iroquois allies.
Sure. There was several scouts, both I believe Tuscarora and Oneida, accompanied. And Oneida, well, some were good, some were bad, depending on the time of day. But the Oneida had technically decided to cast their lot with the Continentals and with the Americans. So there were a number of scouts, and some of those who did fight on the American side. I couldn't help, in all my research, feeling really sorry for the Seneca, because they were taken advantage of by anyone they decided to side with. I believe it was 1637 or maybe 1687 when the French came across Lake Ontario and invaded the area of Victor and I think Medina.
Menden, Menden would have been.
Yeah, Menden, yeah. So it goes. Their distrust of Europeans goes back long before. I think my family set foot here, and that was about 1660. But distrust the Europeans, and who could you trust, who you didn't. I think Joseph Brant took the best of the worst, I guess. So he knew the lifestyle that they knew was probably over, regardless of who won. So he just tried to get the best he could for his people.
Well, we're coming up where the time where we have to break, and I'm going to ask you to just plug your book, where you're going to be reading or doing your presentation.
Sure. This probably was our last book because we've been kind of priced out of the business. And it's been, I had two bucket list books I wanted to do. One was the history of South Lima, and one was Behold and Blush on the Sullivan Expedition. So we're going to do one event, and that's coming up on the 23rd. We're going to do a book signing at the Holland Land Office in Batavia from 1 to 4 on the 23rd. We're going to have 5 or 6 of our books with us. The 2 on the Linden murders, Behold and Blush. We have a cold case book I did called Candles in the Rain. So we're going to have a number of projects with us. So stop by. Always support the museum. They've always been good to us. So we'll be there on September 23rd.
All right. Go back. So I'm experimenting, as you can tell, with how.
Yeah. Thanks for hanging in there with us. This is going to probably be a tough edit for you, but
I'll take care of it. So thank you, Rob, for being here today. Thank you all for watching and listening today. And just a reminder that if at any time you would like to be a member of our live audience, feel free to do that by going to stateofgreaterwestnewyork.com. You sign up for free there, and every Thursday morning you'll get the link to where to see this show live on the internet at noon. Now, I realize a lot of people work. It's tough to watch it live. Well, then you can watch it on our archive. Same place, stateof.greaterwestnewyork.com. You can just see there on the front page all the different type of subjects that we cover. You can look under history for this one. Otherwise, if you like our Facebook page or if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, that's it. Every Sunday at 1:30, the show is rebroadcast on both of those platforms. So that's it for now. Rob, thank you very much. And
okay. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.
Thanks for being here. We'll see you all next week. Bye for now.